Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Jon Pardi, titled Write You a Song. Now, way back in my special comment on the state of modern country music, I made an observation that I feel will end up proving frighteningly relevant this year. That when the bro country bubble implodes, there's going to be a lot of brand new country acts who hopped upon the bandwagon too late who are going to really suffer for it. Now, sure, the A-lister acts like Luke Bryan and Florida Georgia Line, they're going nowhere. But what about the B-listers? The guys who might be able to only count on maybe one or two hits charting at all? What happens when their careers when the bro country well inevitably runs dry? And make no mistake, this is coming. Between the increasingly large number of country acts speaking out against this trend, and both songwriters and radio programmers questioning the lack of diversity in country radio, the winds are changing here. Even guys like Florida Georgia Line are opting for less obviously pandering bro country with their new singles like Stay, if only to prove that they are more than just their big hit song cruise. As such, I'm suspecting that 2014 will be a very transitional year for country music. And from a look at some of the upcoming albums, most notably Eric Church's new album, it could be a very interesting one. But all that said, I couldn't help but feel a certain twinge of unease when I picked up the debut album of Jon Pardi, Write You a Song. His hit was Up All Night, which was a song that did fit into the realm of interchangeable bro country, albeit with a little bit less of the leering sensibilities in that irk me in that genre. And combined with a criminally underwritten Wikipedia page and every picture of this guy reinforcing that bro country image, I got the feeling that Jon Pardi was going to be headed into very rough times in the early months of 2014. By the way, a bad time to release an album as a very late arrival to the bro country scene. But then again, there's been bro country songs and material that I've liked, so I gave the album a few listens just to get an idea of where this guy's coming from. How did it turn out? Well, here's the funny thing. I have to say this, I may have misjudged Jon Pardi because outside of his main hit, his album is not a bro country record, instead sticking much closer to the neo-traditional country music well, such as acts like Chris Young. In other words, Jon Pardi's probably going to end up being very unfairly judged by his one big hit so far, when instead we have an artist on our plate who on a musical level could have fit into any of the neo-traditional country scene throughout the past 2 decades, which, kind of be honest, it will probably end up saving his long-term career. But that being said, I can't say that his album Write You a Song is anything close to a great album. It might be fairly decent, but there's a few big problems on it that are impossible for me to really ignore. So okay, let's start with Jon Pardi himself, and I'll begin by saying that I'm not the biggest fan of his voice. It's a bit nasal, it doesn't exactly have a lot of emotional range, but to his credit, it's not like his material requires a lot of range. He's looking to sound straightforward and sincere in his affections on songs on a bunch of lightweight songs about life on the road and tumultuous relationships. And you know what? He can pull this off fairly easily, and it helps that there really aren't any ballads on this album that require him to stretch himself. That being said, he's not exactly subtle, and you can definitely tell from some of his delivery that he's still getting used to being a country singer and a performer. Now, greatly, that will likely go away with time and just more album releases, but it's noticeable here, and it doesn't especially come across as polished as it could. Now, the one area that does show some quality and polish and expertise is in the instrumentation and production, which for me was easily the highlight of this album. The production was crisp and memorable, the guitar tones were well chosen and striking, and the album had a lot of country flavor in a very early to mid-90s sort of way, with banjos and fiddles and enough texture to really stand out. In fact, you know what, you could almost deem this album, with its lack of drum machines, rougher guitar tones, pluckier instrumentation, or backing vocals, as something of a throwback to earlier times, which I should stress is not a bad thing. However, once you start getting used to the older style of instrumentation, which for me, which was a welcome change, you then start to notice that the melodies on this album aren't exactly complex or all that interesting. And there are plenty of points where that lack of complexity does come across as aggressively corny. Now, sure, there is a bunch of some decent hooks, but it's hard to see a lot in the instrumentation on this record that's all that special. You get your power chords, you get a couple good changes throughout the melodies, you get a couple of very, very basic fiddle breakdowns and guitar solos. That's passable to be sure, but none of it's all that great or special. So okay, What about the songwriting? Well, to Jon Pardi's credit, he's a decent technical songwriter, and there's a couple tracks that really did stand out for me in a good way. The title track is a road song where he promises to write songs for all the girls he meets and sleeps with on the road. And to be fair with Pardi, he frames it as if he'd like to have a relationship with some of these women if his touring schedule and career would allow it. So he comes across as sincere enough on this song, so it's kind of likable. And then for me, the highlight of the album is Empty Beer Cans, which tackles the tricky balance of being a kiss-off song blasting an ex, which is never a good or pleasant song to write, and yet shows how petty and crass some of that behavior can be. And it properly doesn't frame him in being a pleasant light or showing him as anything more than being a bit of a dick when he's doing this and when he's burning photographs and being a general ass about it. But here's the thing, there's an odd element that really put me off some of these songs, and that some of these tracks, they just sound presumptuous, especially when they're talking about potential girls that Jon Pardi is going to try to hook up with. The song That Man tries to play the nice guy card, stepping in when a long-held crush of his breaks up with her boyfriend, and look, it doesn't come across as all that classy. Then there's Love You From Here, where the girl walks out on him and he tries to convince her to stay by saying he'll love her wherever she is and he's not giving up on her. And you know what, it's kind of fortunate that Pardi doesn't have a really wide range, because while he doesn't really come across as threatening or creepy on the song, he doesn't look as nearly as good or as romantic as he thinks he does. And then there's the final track, When I've Been Drinking, where he tries to apologize for calling an ex when he's drunk, and you can tell at the intent of the song that he'd think the girl in question would find this all sweet and romantic, when in reality, I don't think most girls like hearing drunken phone calls from their ex-boyfriends. Because here's the strange problem here. Jon Pardi, he's clearly not a bad guy, and his lack of vocal range, in this case, plays to his credit, almost painting him as naive instead of creepy. But the presumptions that he makes, suggesting that women will find his brand of clumsy affection actually romantic, to me it sucks some of the drama out of the song. He seems so assured that things will happen and the audience will immediately buy into his romantic entreaties that he loses a certain amount of charm and likability. He just comes across as a little bit brash. And look, I get that women are drawn to this sort of confidence, but there's a strange lack of perspective from his point of view on these songs that doesn't quite match the nuance on the other tracks. And the sad fact is that this strange problem crops up more often than it doesn't, which is a shame. It doesn't match his vocal presence all that all. He doesn't really come across as a believable alpha dog, if that makes any sense. So okay, in summary, Jon Pardi's Write You a Song, it's an album that surprised me by going in an old school direction, but sadly ultimately doesn't do enough in that vein to really stand out. Now, I'll admit that I like Empty Beer Cans and the title track more than I probably should, basically because they're both playing on nostalgic feelings I have for neo-traditional country, but even the bad songs on this album, they show more clumsiness and novice songwriting than poor intent, which isn't a bad thing. The flaws are in the execution, and I'm confident that things will get better on future albums for Jon Pardi. That being said, I'm going to give this album a 6 out of 10, and a recommendation only if you're looking for some solid, if relatively unremarkable, neo-traditionalist country. However, I will say this. Given how modern country radio is going with the collapse of bro country and the inevitable rush to fill that void, I suspect we'll be seeing a fair bit more of Jon Pardi very soon, so I can only hope he gets better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any albums coming out in 2014 that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.